So Ravens flock, I wanted to talk about Lamar Jackson's potential, and I wanted to talk about have the Baltimore Ravens, maximize Lamar Jackson's potential, or have they simply taken his potential for granted and given him the bare minimum, or is it somewhere in between those two? I wanted to talk about that because now we are going to be entering the 8th season of Lamar Jackson's career, and as we go further and further into Lamar's career without yet getting a Super Bowl, we have to look back. We have to continuously look back at the moves the Ravens have made when it comes to roster construction. And we have to ask, has this been enough? Especially when you look at the way other teams in the NFL have chosen to build their teams around their quarterback. Has this been enough? So to me, there's four ways that you could and should build around your quarterback. One being building a great offensive line. Two being having elite skill position players, so like receivers and tight ends and running backs. Or then three would be having great coaching / play calling. And then four would be having a great defense that can create timely turnovers and get necessary stops and get the ball back to that quarterback as soon as possible. So as far as the offensive line is concerned, I think the Ravens have come up short in that department significantly throughout most of Lamar Jackson's career. The last time I truly felt like the Ravens had a legitimately good or dominant offensive line was 2019. But ever since then, our offensive line has been mostly just hit or miss at best, and then average at best, I guess you could say, and then a dumpster at worst. Just a dumpster fire. Like we all know, obviously Marshall Yanda, he retired after 2019, and then not too long after that, we ended up unnecessarily rushing to trade Orlando Brown Jr., who's one of our starting tackles. We traded him to the Chiefs of all people without an actual replacement lined up. And then, of course, also Ronnie Stanley started dealing with injuries, so he was hurt for multiple years. And because we didn't have depth at the tackle position, we had to I don't want to say had to, but the Ravens chose to force Ronnie, in my opinion, forced him back prematurely, which re-injured him and prolonged his recovery process. And then because we didn't have any answers at tackle, because one of our starting tackles was hurt, and then the other one, we gave him away to the Chiefs. This is how we end up in a scenario where we have a guy like Alejandro Villanueva, who not only was garbage, but he single-handedly destroyed our 2021 season. Because if y'all remember, when Lamar got injured in the pocket, Alejandro's the one. Well, he was one of the ones that missed his block. It always seems as though Eric DeCosta never truly has a plan at any position on the offensive line. There never seems to actually be a plan. Like even with Ronnie Stanley, the only reason we brought back Ronnie Stanley in free agency is because Ronnie is such a nice guy and he wants to play with Lamar and on this team, so he chose to take a cheap deal. Ronnie didn't get his full value. Ronnie Stanley is worth at least $25 million a year. There were reports coming out from beat writers associated with other teams like the Patriots, and I believe these beat writers, where they are alleging that the Patriots were about to back up a Brinks truck. They were about to back up a Brinks truck for Ronnie Stanley. He was going to be making at least $100 million. And I believe him. You look at all the money they've dished out to players to go join the Patriots. I do think they were going to give Ronnie that type of money. The Ravens got lucky that Ronnie wants to stay here. But if Ronnie had tried to fight for his real worth, they weren't going to pay him. They were just going to let him walk. And again, we don't have an answer. We don't have any backup tackles. We were fortunate enough to where, okay, we drafted Roger Rosengarten, so we finally have a legitimate long-term answer at right tackle. Okay. Tyler Linderbaum was a good draft pick. He's a good center. We have Ronnie locked in for at least the next 3 seasons. But we still have two massive holes at guards, and they don't have a plan for it. We brought in Josh Jones, but we really didn't play him like that, even though he was pretty solid. But now he's gone. He's gone. He went to Seattle. We have Ben Cleveland. We drafted Ben Cleveland like 3-4 years ago, but Harbaugh hates him, so he's never going to see the field. We re-signed him, but to me that doesn't mean anything because he's never going to see the field. Andrew Voorhees is okay, but he's not deserving of a starting. He's not deserving of being given a starting role automatically. And Lele is just bad. Like, technically he made the Pro Bowl, but he ain't make it because he was actually good. He made it because he's teammates with Lamar Jackson. So on the O-line front, I don't think the Ravens did everything necessary to maximize Lamar Jackson, because if you have a special if you have any quarterback, but let alone a special quarterback, your goal should be to make him as well protected as possible, because he's already shown you that even with a bad O-line, he can make them look better than what they are by running around and escaping pressure. It's not going to kill you to say, okay, let's at least put a solid unit around him on that offensive line so there's no questions. They brought in Kevin Zeitler. That was a good move. But then you prematurely let Kevin Zeitler walk without a plan to replace him. And Kevin Zeitler's still playing at a high level. And at times, I just wonder how much more dangerous we could have been, how much more dangerous Lamar could have been if we had a dominant O-line, or at least an above-average O-line, or in some cases, at least an average O-line, Like in the words of Myles Garrett, when talking about Lamar, because, Myles has a lot of respect for Lamar, he said, hey, he kind of was sneak dissing the offensive line, but he basically said, it's easy to block when you're blocking for Houdini. And he's not wrong. At the end of the day, when the O-line comes up short, Lamar bails them out in many cases. But I would like to see an O-line where top to bottom we have guys who can actually build a wall. So I don't think the Ravens have really maximized Lamar's potential from the O-line as far as protecting him. And as far as the skill position conversation, that's a more trickier conversation, because I think the Ravens have done a good job at tight end. Mark Andrews, even though he doesn't show up in the playoffs, he's been a very solid player who's produced in the regular season. And in my opinion, Isaiah Likely is a superstar. And I really hope that they finally let him take over as tight end 1, because Isaiah Likely is a superstar, and we're not fully maximizing him. That might be a video by itself, is like, when are we going to maximize Isaiah Likely's potential? But so I think at tight end, they've done a good job, to be fair to them. At running back, I think they've done an okay job. We brought in Mark Ingram, and we brought in Mark Ingram in 2019. That was good. That was solid. Gus Edwards was an undrafted free agent. He was also very solid for us. I like Gus. I'm sure many of you also like Gus. J.K. Dobbins, I think on paper, it should have been a home run hit. But unfortunately, J.K. Dobbins, he couldn't stay healthy. So I don't really want to hold that against the Ravens front office, because, that's just bad luck. And they did bring in Derrick Henry. I wanted Saquon Barkley, because Saquon is younger and, and still in his prime. Derrick's still playing at an elite level, and clearly Derrick has some prime years. He has some prime years left as well. However, because of Derrick's age, there's always going to be the question of, number one, are the Ravens going to extend him? And number two, is he going to fall off any day now? But nonetheless, I still you still got to give the Ravens credit because at the end of the day, they brought in Derrick when everybody thought he didn't have nothing left, and he has played like the second best running back in football, arguably the best. So from that angle, yes, they've done solid at tight end, and they've done good enough at running back. But then the next conversation becomes wide receiver, of course, and this is the biggest issue because the wide receiver position has become more important than it's ever been. But unfortunately, the Ravens have continuously come up short when it comes to wide receiver. Despite us drafting more wide receivers than anybody, we have missed on so many receivers. So many. And to this day, we've never seen Lamar Jackson play with a true number one wide receiver. We've never seen it. I know a lot of fans, they like Zay Flowers, but Zay's not a number one, guys. Like he is a really solid number two that we're kind of making the number one by default, just like what we did with Hollywood Brown. Now Rashad Bateman, he's an interesting case because even though technically he's not the number one, ironically enough, he has the ceiling to be a number one, if he stays healthy and gets more targets. So I'm interested to see if he finally, gets takes that leap. But until he takes that leap, we can't officially say he's the number one. So as of right now, Lamar has never truly played with a true number one, especially not one in his prime. When we bring and that goes into another issue. When we bring in wide receivers in free agency or via trade or whatever, it's always guys who are very low end wide receivers, or it's guys who are washed up and are 5 years, more or less 5 years past their prime. So you end up in a scenario where you got guys like we just brought in DeAndre Hopkins. Now if this was 5 years ago, this would be a major move, but it's not. D Hop is not the same player anymore. He's on his last legs, which is why he agreed to come here in the first place. He had a chance to come here 2 years ago. He didn't want to. Like it is what it is. At the end of the day, you look at D Hop, you look at Odell Beckham Jr., you look at Deshaun Jackson, you look at Des Bryant. Like we've had a long history of bringing in over the hill wide receivers and hoping that we can get lucky and squeeze a little bit more elite juice out of their career, and it just never happens like that. It simply doesn't. We get rarely you'll see a scenario like, okay, we brought in Anquan Bolden and he balled out. We brought in Steve Smith at the end of his career and he balled out. Okay, but at the end of the day, those are rare situations. There are way more situations like Odell and Deshaun Jackson than there are situations like Anquan Bolden and Steve Smith. Especially in the Lamar Jackson era specifically, we have simply missed on every one of those older wide receivers who we try to get for cheap. And this is to me, this is another area the Ravens have come up extremely short, and it's a major indictment because the wide receiver position is more important than it's ever been. There's a reason guys like Justin Jefferson are making $35 million a year. There's a reason guys like Jamar Chase are making $40 million a year. Even for a high-end number two receiver like T. Higgins or Jalen Waddle, those guys are making $28 million a year. And those are guys who, if they were on our teams, they would be number ones. Like the wide receiver position is more important than ever, and yet we still don't spend much money on it. And on top of not spending much money on it, we don't draft well in that position. We've had a couple of decent picks, of course, like Hollywood, Zay, and now you can say Bateman as well, but we've also had a bunch of misses. It doesn't even make sense to even name all of the wide receivers we've missed on in the past 7 years. It's just a long list. And as great as Lamar Jackson is, I can't help but wonder how much greater he could have been if he had a true number one wide receiver for his entire career, or at least most of his career, especially on his rookie contract when that was the ideal time for us to do it, but the Ravens didn't want to do it. They didn't want to spend that money. Like, we already seen that Lamar can go out there and even with the bare minimum at wide receiver, Willie Snead and like Seth Robertson, all of that, he still was the unanimous MVP and led the league in touchdowns. And instead of us trying to put fire on the, instead of us trying to put like gasoline on that flame to try to make that fire intensify. Wait. Instead of us trying to put, instead of us trying to stoke the flames and make that fire bigger and bigger, we instead just kept doubling down on doing the bare minimum. And I think that's very disappointing. And to me, that is one of the major, if that's probably the biggest example of us not really trying to maximize Lamar Jackson's potential. Now, the next area that we could talk about when we talk about building around a QB is coaching and play calling. Now, when it comes to coaching, as far as John Harbaugh, it just was announced a day or two ago that Harbaugh got an extension. I've said already that I don't think Harbaugh should have been extended. I think we should have moved on and tried to find somebody who was younger and more hungry and actually had a message that wasn't going to be as stale as Harbaugh's may be, because no matter what, if you're in the same place for 20 years, your message is going to become stale no matter what. It doesn't matter how good or bad a coach may be, but a more specific example I want to get to coaching is Greg Roman. I hate that I have to keep bringing up Greg Roman, but unfortunately, the Greg Roman era was a big role in Lamar Jackson's career up until this point. Greg Roman was an okay offensive coordinator, but he was not truly that good. He wasn't the worst, but he wasn't that good. And unfortunately, we kept him way longer than we should have. And to me, that stifled Lamar Jackson's potential. It stifled it significantly. It was obvious that Greg Roman was a very limited offensive coordinator and play caller. It was obvious from his time in San Francisco and his time in Buffalo. But yet, we bring him to the Ravens, and not only do the Ravens front office insist on keeping him for all those years, but also the Ravens fans were convincing themselves that this was a good idea. Like, I remember, and I'm going to keep bringing this up, I remember a bunch of Ravens fans kept telling me, like, when I was saying, yo, we need to get rid of this guy, Ravens fans kept trying to argue and say that, hey, what if we get rid of him? Who are we going to replace him with? How will we ever run the ball again? What will we do? We can't replace him. We just can't do it. We can't replace him. And I kept trying to tell y'all that if Lamar, Greg Roman is not the secret sauce there. Lamar Jackson is. If Lamar is healthy, we will still win games, we will still put up points, and we will still run the ball just fine. People didn't want to believe that. People didn't want to get on board with getting rid of Giro until it was absolutely too late. How do I know it was too late? I know it was too late because you started seeing people like Steve Smith clown our offense and say that the scheme is like a high school scheme. You started seeing people like Kurt Warner make film breakdowns saying that this is not a good offensive scheme. You started seeing regular fans who are, casuals who are fans of other teams who started making our offense a punchline and say about how bad it is. By then, once that type of stuff happens, it's already too late. We kept Greg Roman 3 years longer than we should have. So if you like Todd Monken, and I like Todd Monken, if you like Todd Monken and you think that this offense looks amazing, understand we could have had this type of result, this type of offensive improvement. We could have gotten here 3 years earlier if we had fired Greg Roman when we should have fired Greg Roman. You're seeing all these people say, oh my gosh, Lamar Jackson, he's improved so much as a passer. Not really. And don't get me wrong, Lamar always makes incremental improvements on his game year over year. But at the same time, when people think that Lamar's made a significant improvement, it's not that he's necessarily made a significant improvement. Low key, what it really is the fact that with Todd Monken, we just pass the ball more. And so when Lamar's given a chance to just simply throw more passes, he's getting an opportunity to just look like a better passer. He always had the ability to make these passes, but it's a lot harder for people to see that if you're only throwing the ball like freaking 15 times a game, more or less. So I do believe on the coaching standpoint, from us having subpar play calling with Greg Roman, I do believe that stifled Lamar Jackson's growth. And because of that, I don't think from that perspective we maximized Lamar Jackson or even tried to maximize him. We chose complacency. And then the last area when it comes to team building is that I want to think of or talk about is building a defense. The Ravens, and this is the area that the Ravens have put the most effort in when it comes to building a defense. But even though they put the most effort in, I don't necessarily think they've done the best job in that department. Because you look at our defense and it's like we have a bunch of players who are low-key just overpaid players who we're paying them as if they're elite, when in reality they're either bad or in some cases they're not bad, but they're just like slightly above average and not really worth the maximum amount of the insane amount of money that we're paying them. you know and to me that's a dangerous combination, because it's like, all right, you got this defense that you dumped so much resources into, as far as draft picks and trades and free agency signings and contract extensions. Like, you've dumped so much resources into just this area, and they're still not necessarily that special when it counts. Like, yeah, on paper they've had a couple of runs where they've looked really dominant in the regular season, but when it matters most in the playoffs, they're a non-factor. And this is why many Ravens fans want them to stop putting so much money into, and so much resources into defense. It's not because defense doesn't matter, but it's just because in these key moments, nobody is relying on the defense to actually make a difference. Nobody's even calling it out. Like, I'm one of the few people that keep pointing out the fact that in the past 7 years in the playoffs, the Ravens defense they've only forced 3 turnovers in 7 years. For comparison, the Chiefs defense in that same time period, they forced about more or less 20. And the Eagles in that same time period, they have forced 18 turnovers. The Bills in that same time period, they have forced 12 turnovers. The 49ers defense in that same time period, they have forced 13 turnovers. Even a team like the Commanders that haven't even made the playoffs in years, just this year alone, their defense, which in the regular season wasn't even that good, their defense, once they got to the playoffs, their defense forced 6 turnovers. Let that sink in. This Ravens defense that has all of this money and all of these high draft picks dumped into it, all of this money we've spent overpaying people, all of these draft picks that we have used on defense, and yet when we get to the playoffs, they literally have only produced 3 turnovers in 7 years. Is that really a good return on investment? Is that really maximizing your quarterback? In my opinion, not really, because if you're going to choose to dump this much resources into the defensive side of the ball, it should be standard. It should be expected that these guys go out there and produce turnovers when it matters most. That way they can get the ball back to Lamar so he can go put up points, so he could lead touchdown drives, so he could put us in position to win. You look at teams like the Eagles, and I've said this multiple times over the past couple months. If you look at a team like the Eagles, if Jalen Hurts makes a mistake, it's not the end of the world, because they have a legitimately elite defense. See, they don't have a fraudulent defense like we do, where they look good on paper and they look good against bad teams, but when we get to the playoffs, they're just a bunch of non-factors. No, they got a real defense, a real elite defense. And it's not just because of first round draft picks, because I've seen some people say that, like, oh well, they only have this elite defense because they picked in the top 10 guys. Nolan Smith, who's one of their many edge rushers. The guy, they picked him in like the third round, I think it was. Cooper DeJean literally had a pick six, guys, in the Super Bowl. Right after Jalen Hurts threw a very bad interception. That mistake Jalen Hurts made was immediately erased because Cooper DeJean had a pick six against Patrick Mahomes. Mind you, Cooper DeJean is a second round pick, guys. He is a second round pick. And that goes into, of course, another issue that we have to keep bringing up, which is DeCosta's not good at drafting. And in general, even though I don't think DeCosta is the worst, overall, I don't think DeCosta is really good at team construction. I just don't. Because you look at teams like the Eagles and all the areas that I just mentioned when it comes to team building, the Eagles will do a better job overall in these pretty much every area. You know, they not only do they have an elite defense on paper, but they have an elite defense that actually shows up and produces turnovers in the playoffs when it matters most. They have great play calling. And then even when they have periods where they have like a underwhelming offensive or defensive coordinator, they don't hesitate to move on from that person quickly because they feel a sense of urgency. They don't let the guy linger around like we do on the Ravens. You know, they always have an elite offensive line, no matter what. Even if a guy like Jason Kelce retires, they already have a replacement lined up and they don't miss a beat. They have elite skill position players. They have a true number one wide receiver. Whereas we don't, we come up short in those areas. You look at a team like the 49ers. They have an elite defense, but also they have a bunch of weapons to throw the ball to, including a true number one wide receiver in Brandon Ayuk, a really good gadget player in Deebo Samuel, and arguably the best tight end in football in George Kittle, honestly. Even though Travis Kelce is considered the best, there's many seasons over the past like 5 years you could argue that George Kittle is better, especially because George Kittle is a much better blocker. The one area you could say that the Niners were not that good really were their offensive line. And even then, it's like, man, they still had the best tackle in football. And they just drafted, what's the guy named? Dominic Cooney or whatever. So they have an answer at guard. Like, so overall, you know, long story short, I don't think the Ravens did that good of a job building around Lamar Jackson, especially during Lamar's rookie contract. That to me is the most heartbreaking part of everything, is the fact that we had Lamar on a rookie deal, and yet somehow miraculously we still never had money. How does that happen? Well, it's simple. They overpaid for players who don't matter. That's how. And so instead of pulling some money together to pay top dollar to go get a guy like AJ Brown, they instead opted to just say, no, let's just overpay a bunch of subpar and average players and then not really give much to Lamar and just hope that it all just works out. And I don't think that's a good plan. And I think that has really stifled what our potential is, because even Todd Monken did an interview with the Lounge podcast a few weeks ago where Todd Monken himself said that he believes that Lamar has really only scratched the surface of what he's capable of. And I'm just like, man, I feel like we could have gone much further than just a surface if we had made some different decisions with the, how we chose to build this team. But it is what it is. There's still all we could do at this point is hope that they actually start making some better decisions, and hope that some of these, you know, picks that they're making and signings that they make, well, they don't really sign anybody, but hoping some of the draft picks that they make, you know, their $1,000,001 draft picks, you just gotta hope that sooner or later we actually have a truly good draft. Because in my opinion, that would make all of the difference at that point. But we'll see. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Do you think that we maximize Lamar Jackson's potential? And if you think we haven't, do you think that we're ever going to maximize Lamar Jackson's potential?